Hey everyone, and welcome back. Or if you're new here, hi, I'm Mackenzie, aka Astromac, and I'm a professional astrologer and I talk all things astrology on this channel. And today we are talking all about Aquarius, that sign of the collective reformer and the visionary and the experimental innovator of the Zodiac. And Aquarius is this energy that really embodies like this abstract, out of the box, future-oriented thinking with a desire for freedom and liberation. And so it's a sign that's known for being like, being a little bit out there because it's just kind of like this unique and quirky and eccentric form of self-expression. And it really just kind of, rejects all forms of conformity. And so there is a lot to this kind of like elusive air sign. And so if you want to understand Aquarius energy on a much deeper level or, understand the Aquarians in your life, then this is your Aquarius 101 video. And so Aquarius is the 11th sign of the zodiac, following the practical and ambitious and determined and hardworking sign of Capricorn. And Aquarius is the fixed air sign of the zodiac that is ruled by Saturn and co-ruled by Uranus, and it's that sign that's also represented by the Water-bearer. And so Aquarius is really looking to create something that will last a long time using ideas and concepts, being an air sign. But I would say of all the air signs, being Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius, which are the social signs, I would say that Aquarius is probably like the least social, but it's still concerned with the social world, but in a more like detached and abstract way. And so it's in Aquarius that we really build on those Capricorn foundations and we innovate them and we change them in ways that can better suit, all of humanity, because Aquarius is the sign of the humanitarian. Capricorn is much more about these personal goals and these personal ambitions, but now in Aquarius, this is where we kind of expand our vision and we connect with a larger community and we really align our personal goals with a collective purpose or a collective cause in mind. And so it's where we really join forces with others to create something even bigger. And so again, it's all about this collective purpose and collaboration and having a shared vision that a group is working towards. It's kind of teamwork makes the dream work kind of energy. And so Capricorn is what builds these structures and it builds these systems, but then Aquarius comes in and asks why are we doing it this way? And wouldn't it be better if we did it this way? And it just it innovates these systems. And so that's why Aquarius is associated with being it can be the awakeners or the disruptors or the reformers, but it's all doing this with a better future in mind. This is where things stop being personal and it starts thinking more collectively. Because Aquarius really asks what works for everyone and what works for the whole, with a W. Because it's all about these causes that are, just larger than yourself. It's something that impacts everyone. And then another key difference between Capricorn and Aquarius with they're both ruled by Saturn, but Saturn is that planet of time. And so with Capricorn, I feel it's more associated with the past, and it tends to be more respectful of traditions and rules and ways of doing things. This is how they've always been done, and so let's follow this set of rules and these traditions and just build on these structures that already exist. Whereas in Aquarius, that element of time is still important, but it's more focused toward the future rather than the past. So Aquarius is just very future oriented and future minded, and so their ideas can sometimes come across as being a little bit abstract and a little bit out there, but it's usually just they tend to be way ahead of the curve, really. And so these are the people who kind of live in Tomorrowland or Tomorrow World, where they're just thinking way ahead. And so you can also think of Capricorn is just this linear building over time. It's all about, climbing that mountain one step at a time. And so it's very, goal focused and linear way of doing things over time. Whereas I think Aquarius kind of perceives time a little bit differently, and it's, less linear and it's more a network or a grid. Aquarius really views events and situations as being, all interconnected yet happening simultaneously. It's almost it wants to go beyond time and space. And so people with strong Aquarius placements can almost get frustrated sometimes when we aren't in this future vision of where they want to be yet. They're if I can picture it in my mind, then it should be here already. And so it's this sense of wanting to create this vision in their head immediately. But then they kind of forget about this very important element of like the tediousness of time. And so I found that Aquarius placements, it's kind of like they almost wish that they could transcend time in a way. And so there's just like this very like, cerebral and abstract and mental energy that comes with Aquarius that can be really hard to like try and put into words. And so Aquarius being like so ahead of their time, they can kind of, rebel against the norms, the societal norms, and they can kind of, go against the mainstream because they're envisioning, where things should be or, where things could be. And so this is where we kind of get like this non-conformist kind of energy with Aquarius. And so because of this, it's kind of like it can sometimes be hard for them to connect with people unless they are also aligned with like this vision that they have for the future. And it's just because, again, they have this more like futuristic minded quality. And like, that's fine. It's not like Aquarius needs to connect with you. Like, unlike a Libra, it's kind of like they don't really care. Like they are perfectly fine with their books and their electronics and like their own group of people who are aligned with their vision. And so they have this energy of like, they don't need to be loved by everyone. And so if we think in terms of like, our journey through the Zodiac so far, we're at the 11th sign. So we're almost at the end here. The only sign that we have left is Pisces. And so in Aquarius, this is where things get, a little more complex. And so like, Aries through Libra was its own journey. And so then once we got to Scorpio, this is where we, dove deep and we met our shadows and we transformed through facing these things that are not easy. And then once we, reach Sagittarius, this is where, we come out of like those deep, dark waters and we set our sights on the horizons and we, have this desire to expand our mind and expand our horizons through like, travel and higher learning. And so it's where we were growing and expanding and, dreaming up like all of these things that we want to do in our life. And then in Capricorn, that's where we took these Sagittarius visions and we started to like take action on them and started to like make them real. And so, it's one thing to like dream about climbing a mountain, and then it's another thing to actually, start climbing that mountain and start putting like one foot in front of the other. And so Capricorn is all about, taking actions on our dreams and taking actions on our ambitions in order to, make them real. And so now in Aquarius, it's kind of like, this is that energy of, after we have climbed our Capricorn mountain. So it's kind of like we've reached our ultimate pinnacle here. And, think about like that vantage point that you have once you've, climbed a mountain and like how you just see like the bigger picture here. And so Aquarius doesn't really like sweat the small stuff because it sees how like, trivial those small things are. And, in the grand scheme of things and like in the bigger picture, like, those small things aren't really a big deal. And so Aquarius has that wisdom and like that vantage point to really, see how amazing it is to, even be alive on Earth. And then it wants to, share that wisdom with others. Because Aquarius, again, it wants to move humanity forward and improve humanity. And so it does so by like, sharing those thoughts and their ideas and their wisdom that they have from like that zoomed out perspective and from that higher vantage point. And so again, you can think of Aquarius energy as like, that higher vantage point from like the top of that mountain or like, the vantage point from the clouds or whatever. And so whether you have Aquarius placements or not, you still have Aquarius somewhere in your chart. And so we all have Aquarius energy somewhere within us. Like, for me, I don't have any Aquarius placements, but I do have Aquarius on my MC. So I have like these Aquarian reputation and like an Aquarius calling. And so even though I don't have these Aquarius placements, like I have found that I've always felt a little bit like an outsider. And I think that is that Aquarius MC because, people just kind of perceive me that way. And so wherever you have Aquarius in your own chart, like, what house that you have Aquarius on, this tends to be an area of life where you just need to kind of like zoom out a little bit, or where you naturally are zoomed out and, where you just need a little bit of extra space from others, or, you yourself might feel like an outsider, or like you don't fit in this house, or you're just kind of like, on the fringes, kind of, observing and taking that detached approach, or, you may just be kind of like an individualist in this house. But it's also where you're creative and where you innovate and where you help move society and humanity forward. And so it could also be like, where you rebel a little bit and where you, go against those societal norms, or it could also be like, where you inspire others as well. So you'll have to let me know if you perceive me as being Aquarius. And so archetypally, Aquarius is the visionary and the humanitarian, or they could be perceived as the outsider or the rebel. And, it's also, being a very cerebral sign. It's like the genius or the innovator or the inventor or the reformer, and that detached observer. And it's the sign that is just like revolutionary, that really pushes humanity forward because it's a sign that is way ahead of its time. And so it's an archetype that tends to exist slightly out of time, because Aquarians tend to be ahead of whatever era that they're living in. And so that's why Aquarians are frequently misunderstood and dismissed or labeled weird long before they get validated. And so you might see this stereotype of Aquarians being the alien, but it's funny because Aquarians are the humanitarian, and so they're actually the most human of all the signs. But I have found that Aquarius placements do tend to feel ostracized in some way or alienated. Not always, but it's just this feeling of being an outsider or an observer in life. And they just kind of, dance to the beat of their own drum in life. And so they tend to be a little bit quirky and a little bit out there and a little bit weird, but weird in the good way. And so they are inventive as well and eccentric, and they're just these individualists, and they really don't give a shit what you think about them. These are the people who, again, they just, go against the grain. And so sometimes they can rub people the wrong way, especially if those people are more conservative or traditional, and they stick to the rules, and they're this is the way things have always been done. Why are you, trying to be weird? And so Aquarians can sometimes seem like they're a little bit out of touch, and they've got their head in the clouds, and they're living in this castle in the sky, and they kind of are. But it's because they are just 10 to 20 steps ahead of everyone. And so Aquarians are not these general consensus type thinkers. Again, they think outside of the box and they think abstractly. And this really differs from Capricorn, because Capricorn kind of sees things in this very structured and linear and hierarchy type way, where they just put their nose to the grindstone and they work hard and they, work their way up the ranks, or, up that corporate ladder, or, whatever it is to get to the top of, whatever their chosen mountain is. Whereas Aquarius is thinking abstractly and thinking forward and working towards a cause. Aquarius thinks outside of the box. It's if I build this airplane, then I don't have to climb my way up that mountain one step at a time, and I can, fly a group of people up to the top of the mountain with less effort, It's that kind of energy. And so I've noticed that sometimes Aquarians can almost swing too far in one direction, where they're trying really hard to go against the grain and stand out from the crowd, and they have this singular focus on being different. And in doing so, again, they can almost alienate themselves in that process. And so there can be this weird paradox with Aquarius, because, they are very independent, but it's a sign that also has to do with humanity as a whole and the collective. But they are these very solo flyers who they don't really care to fit in, and they want to carve out their own unique path. And so you might hear an Aquarius say I don't fit in, I'm just different. But, sometimes this kind of veers into this terminal uniqueness where, again, they alienate themselves or they ostracize themselves from a group, trying to be different. And so this is where finding a community that is like-minded, or, finding a community that has a similar goal or vision in mind for the future, this is where that needs to come in for Aquarius placements. Because Aquarius needs to recognize that, they don't need to spend their whole life being a lone wolf. When we think about the symbolism of the water-bearer, yes, this water-bearer is alone, up high, but it's also sharing what it knows, and it's sharing their knowledge and sharing their ideas. And so, if you're an Aquarius and you're cutting yourself off, that's not a healthy expression of Aquarius, because Aquarius energy, it's kind of it has this responsibility to the community in a way, and Aquarius has this social conscience. Because again, the higher expression of Aquarius is where, they are the humanitarians and the activists who want freedom and liberation and equality for all of humanity. And it's easier to make these waves of change and these waves of liberation and revolution as a community. It spreads, and sure, it starts with the self, but, you also need to connect and, spread your message faster. I know I kind of talked about how Aquarius is that energy that has that vantage point from on top of that mountain, but it's really a sign that you find when everyone is on equal ground, and you're part of something larger than yourself, and you're part of that collective. Like, I tend to always think of constellations when I think of Aquarius energy, because it's like, everyone is being their own individual and unique star, and like they have their own individual self-expression, but then, they all come together and they all work together to create a larger picture. And this bigger picture that they have in mind is like this freedom and liberation and equality for all. And so, like, freedom and liberation are just like these solid pillars and principles for Aquarius placements. And having sovereignty and authority over their thoughts and decisions, while also having respect for others' autonomy. And like that sovereignty tends to come through really, really strong when I see like, strong Aquarius placements. And so Aquarius is really here to awaken us and inspire us and really, open our minds to new possibilities of what the future could be. And so in this, like, trying to awaken us, sometimes they can be a little bit disruptive, but they're really trying to liberate us from the status quo and encourage us to continue evolving. And so they can be very like progressive and radical and unconventional even. Because the aim of Aquarius energy is like this individuation and liberation and freedom and, ultimately revolution. And so I think this is why Aquarius energy can be a little bit like, hard to pin down, because there is like this almost elusive and unattainable quality sometimes. Because it can be like they're too busy trying to, stand out from the crowd and, rejecting conformity and trying to avoid being controlled or contained or smothered at all cost. Because it's like they just want to be like these individuals and they want to do what they want to do and no one is going to tell them otherwise. And so just because they are all about like this individuation doesn't necessarily mean that they are loners, although I have found that Aquarians do love to kind of be alone. But Aquarius is also really good at bringing groups and communities together with a common cause or goal in mind. The key is that they just need to be able to like be their own individual self within the group. And so, being the star within the constellation. It's like that interconnectedness and that interdependence that's most important with Aquarius. And being ruled by Saturn and Uranus, they really don't like to answer to authorities, and so they usually prefer to be like the leader of a group or like the leader in a revolution. The point in creating community for Aquarius, though, is like that commonality and that like-mindedness. And, with Aquarius being an air sign, it's kind of like, everything happens through these mental faculties, and so it's a very, cerebral and mentally connected sign. And so if these groups and communities that they create can really come together and work towards a common vision or a common goal or a common idea or cause, especially like a socially aware cause, that's even better. And so I found that you kind of have to just give Aquarius space to be themselves and accept them for who they are, because even though they are the sign of the humanitarian and they have to do with like groups and communities and they have a love of humanity, they don't always love being around people. Aquarius also being that archetype of like, the rebel or the reformer or the innovator. I found that like Aquarius at its best, it's not like they rebel without a cause or they rebel just to be destructive, although it definitely can be in that lower expression. But usually they're like going against the grain and they're rebelling for a cause because they just really have this focus on the future and innovating, and they have like an absolute loyalty to the truth. And you kind of have to in order to not conform and, not give in to peer pressure or socialization or like, just getting on the bandwagon. And so to do that, like, you have to be able to like, stand alone, and you have to be able to say what you see regardless of the consequences. And so that's where that truth bit comes in. And you have to be able to like stand firm even when your freedom is challenged. And so I think that's why, Aquarians make such great like rebel leaders and like great activists. But with them being able to like, tell the truth and just like tell it how it is, I think this is where they can kind of get that reputation for being like, contrarian or even cold or aloof. And I really don't like that cold stereotype that Aquarians get, because some of the Aquarians that I know are like the most warm and generous and loving people, but they kind of love from a distance. Because they might feel that like, too much emotion could like, sway their moral standing or sway like their bigger picture that they have. And so they prefer to like, hold their emotions in that container, like the Water-bearer, and like, compartmentalize their emotions and distance themselves from them, because when they feel them, like they feel those emotions, it can be a lot and it can be really overwhelming. And so these are kind of like the therapist friends where they're really good at like taking in other people's emotions and making space in their jug for other people's feelings, but they also need to make time to understand their own emotions as well and actually feel their feelings. And so Aquarius is really good at like, almost getting other people to open up because they have this big container that's like this big vessel, and they don't necessarily get like emotionally involved in your story or in your feelings, but they can really hold space for you and your emotions and like your secrets, and they can do so in a very objective way. And they have a very open mind to people who are considered like different, and they accept people who are different very easily. But then with like, they themselves, it can be very hard for them to be vulnerable and open in that same way. And so again, they can really compartmentalize their emotions when they want to, because it's like they feel like if they, dive deep down into their emotions, where it's like, dark and messy and scary, that makes it hard to see things objectively and to really, see the whole picture when they're like, in it and they're feeling it. So they just need some space in order to like, analyze how they're feeling and like, see the bigger picture and see if like their own reactions and how they're feeling really suits the situation, because again, they want to see like their emotions objectively rather than like being in it and feeling in it, because they can get very overwhelmed very easily, almost like they like short circuit sometimes. And so these are people who can be really good friends and acquaintances with people, but then, they're only intimate and vulnerable with like, one, maybe two people. And I think that is a common misconception that like, when people know about astrology, they assume that Aquarius is a water sign because it's the water bearer and its glyph looks like those waves of water, but it is an air sign, and air and water are very, very different elementally. And so of all the air signs, I would say that Aquarius is probably like the most cerebral, just like constantly processing things through their mind. And so they do tend to be very like intelligent and bright people, so much so that they tend to be labeled as eccentric sometimes. Like they're kind of like that archetype of the genius, and so they can be a little like, mad scientist or like the mage in a tower. They can just be like a little zany or quirky or, just a little out there. And genius doesn't always mean like intellectually smart, although it does in a lot of cases, but what it means is just having this ability to like think fresh thoughts and to have these new and inspired and innovative ideas. Like they just think in such abstract ways and just like so outside of the box. And so they want to be able to understand like, how things work. So that's why Aquarius tends to be associated with like, science and metaphysics and astrology and science fiction and cosmology. And like, I always think of Albert Einstein when I think of Aquarius. I think he had Jupiter in Aquarius. And so these are just like the inventors of ideas, basically. And again, they're just like these future thinkers. And so they tend to be ahead of like, everyone else's thought processes. And so they kind of view problems in life as like these problems to solve, and they see things in new ways, and they like to find solutions to these problems and solve these problems, and they get creative in the process. So Aquarius is also like a very creative sign, and they do it in order to like liberate themselves and free themselves from problems. And so they also like to try and help other people solve their problems. And they tend to think in ways that like we haven't been taught to think before, and they're brave enough to really challenge the ways that we've thought before. And it can be something as simple as just like, being yourself and being an individual in society that really pushes everyone to conform and to be the same. Again, they just like to go against the grain. And so one of their like essential needs, especially for like Venus in Aquarius, they really need intellectual stimulation. And they don't necessarily need someone to like, bounce ideas off of like a Gemini or a Libra, but they really need that intellectual stimulation that comes from like, conversing with others. Like someone who can help spark a new idea from within them and like, spark that inspiration, or, someone who can help them see things from a different perspective. And so if you want to help make an Aquarius feel seen, really listen to like their ideas and their visions and engage with them on an intellectual level and on a theoretical level, and really validate their ideas and their visions and their thoughts and communicate that to them. And it's not like they necessarily need that feedback, because sometimes if you give it to them unsolicited, they'll be like, I don't give a fuck what you think. But if you are someone that they like trust and respect, then they will love that kind of feedback. Because being ruled by Saturn, they're all about that respect and integrity and honesty, and, they're kind of like Sagittarius in a way where they don't mind hearing like that hard truth. Because I wouldn't say that they so much get like hurt by the truth, but, they would rather hear it so that they can innovate and continue improving and making whatever it is that they're working on even better. Because one of like the main objectives of Aquarius is to really like evolve and push humanity forward. Like, they have this idea of what humanity should and could be like. And so they are these visionaries in a way who dream up these better futures for humanity. And they understand that this evolution doesn't come from like, everyone conforming and everyone being the same and everyone sticking to the rules and doing things the way that they've always been done. Because, what actually evolves humanity is like, exposing yourself to a variety of different ideas and different kinds of people and different places. And, really diversity is what pushes humanity forward. And so again, they can be incredibly like progressive and open-minded, and they think outside of the box, and they just see things differently from most people. And they understand that sometimes you got to break the rules in order to evolve. And so this is why Aquarians are known as like the revolutionaries, because they want to change the world and they want to make it like a better place for everyone. Sometimes, because that's not to say that there haven't been some shitty Aquarians. Aquarius is fixed air, and so if they're an Aquarius who wants to make the world better, then they will do everything in their power to do so. But, it can also be the opposite. Like if they don't care to make the world a better place, it can be kind of destructive in that way. And so it's not like Aquarius rebels for attention. It's just that they really see the inefficiencies in a system and then they cannot unsee them. And that's like that fixed air. And so again, these are the reformers. And so that means that sometimes they have to break things in order to rebuild them in a way that is even better. So it's kind of like in Capricorn. This is what, builds those solid foundations and these walls and boundaries. And then Aquarius comes in and really breaks down those barriers and breaks through these walls in order to build something better and sturdier and more advanced. Like where Capricorn might take its time building that brick wall, Aquarius might come in and like, knock it down or, build on top of that wall and add like a layer of concrete and, add like a moat and like a laser gate and like, a security camera. And actually Aquarius does tend to be associated with technology and like, that kind of advancement. And so again, they may rebel in order to help push society forward and just bring that evolution and bring that advancement. And so where Capricorn tends to be very like, tied to tradition and rules and like, doing things the way that they've always been done, Aquarius are kind of like the rule breakers. And it's not like they'll break any old rule, it's like only those rules that they see that no longer fit their ideal for the future. Like think about those old like societal norms or societal rules or even laws in some cases, just like how silly and ridiculous they might sound to us now. Like I always think of how women used to not be able to show our ankles. And so it's kind of like if Aquarius didn't exist, then, we as women would still not be able to show our ankles. And actually Aquarius rules over the ankles, so I think that's really interesting symbolism there, like showing our ankles maybe was a liberating thing. But Aquarius is that sign that will not settle for the status quo, and it really doesn't like to adhere or conform to these societal norms. It's kind of like, that just makes their skin crawl thinking about it. And being a fixed sign, they can be pretty stubborn. And so when they get an idea, they can get kind of like stuck on it, and they can get like, stuck on this vision that they have in their mind of what, they think that humanity should look like. And so when society doesn't like meet them where they are, that can be pretty upsetting and they can get pretty pissed off. And so like all fixed signs, they can hold a mean grudge when they want to. I would say they maybe don't hold on to those grudges as like strongly or as firmly as like Taurus or Scorpio, but being an air sign, it's kind of like they won't forget what you said to them. And so if you wrong them in any way, whether it's like you lie to them or you betray their trust or you take advantage of their loyalty, they will detach from you quicker than you can take your next breath. Like they will evaporate out of your life quicker than you understand what's going on. And that doesn't mean that they're not emotional about things, because again, they are quite sensitive people. They just don't like getting like emotionally vulnerable. And so when you wrong them, it's just easier for them to cut you out and detach completely. But when they do let themselves be emotionally vulnerable, they can be quite impactful and moving and even inspiring in that way, where they've grown enough to kind of find that emotional vulnerability and be able to express it and reveal that side of themselves. And it's not easy for an Aquarius to do that, They might feel like they might get like too overwhelmed by all of these feelings that they're gonna like, short circuit if they allow themselves to, feel too much. And so when they do start like, feeling too much, that's when they might say something like, I just need some space, because they really do. They just need some space. And so they can detach sometimes in order to, see that bigger picture and zoom out and just see things from a more like objective, like higher point of view. Like it's looking at like the whole forest, not just like an individual tree. And so they want to look at things from like a much larger scale. And so Aquarius is really good at seeing things like, objectively, where they're able to detach and, take on a more like observational perspective. And so that goes back to them having like that, outsider's perspective where, they can be very much like a part of a group and a part of a constellation, but, still feel like an outsider, just kind of, observing rather than like fully engaging, especially if you have like those personal planets in Aquarius or any of your angles. And so seasonally, Aquarius is the fixed sign that really sustains these winter months. And so it's kind of like the height of winter, at least in the northern hemisphere. But, where I live, I experience like extreme seasons. And so Aquarius season is definitely the coldest, where we experience like -20, sometimes -40 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it can be like a tundra outside sometimes. And so I always think of Aquarius season as like, a frozen season. And so it's kind of like a more intense extension of Capricorn season where, we're really having to rely on like, reaping what we have sowed over the previous year. But now we might have to like innovate or get a little more creative or experimental with how we're going to, go about surviving the rest of the winter while simultaneously like checking on neighbors and combining resources where possible until the thaw comes. And so we're inside a lot during Aquarius season where, we have to rely on the people around us and our communities and, our wider networks to survive. It's combining resources and combining strengths. And it's just like a dark and gloomy and really cold time of year where we just need those social connections in order to make it through. And when you're inside a lot, it's kind of a time to really rely on your mental faculties. And it is just like a very mental energy because we're having to, think about what we need to do for ourselves and how we can contribute more to our communities over the next year. And again, being like co-ruled by Saturn, it's kind of like the consequences of our actions from the previous year come to bear. And I would say it's probably less harsh of a reality check than it is in like Capricorn season because it's kind of like now in Aquarius, we've accepted the reality. And now it's kind of like, what are we going to do with this reality? Like we can sit and mope around if we want, or, we can branch out and ask for extra support from community. And so the difference from like Capricorn to Aquarius season is that we're more anchored in like our mental and cerebral energy. And again, it's an air sign, so it's more social and wanting to branch out and connect. And so it's kind of like we're mentally preparing ourselves for the future during this time. And so we may be imagining like a new framework that we can live by and that we can follow over the upcoming year for, a better course of action. And so, we may still be using like the old frameworks as somewhat of like a structure, but we're innovating them and we're progressing them and we're making them better to better serve ourselves as well as our community. And so there's more of a social responsibility in Aquarius because Aquarius has that collective awareness. Like maybe you realize and now you've accepted that like you didn't plant enough food or, maybe you didn't collect enough firewood. And so you really have to rely on your neighbors and their resources. And so it's all about like working together and, just trying to survive and like, everyone combining their resources and their strengths and their skills. Like, maybe you don't have enough firewood, but you have like an abundance of blankets or whatever. But, it's all about just trying to survive and make it through a harsh winter and making it through together. And I think another like key difference between, Capricorn and Aquarius season is that during Capricorn season, that's when we have like our longest nights. And so things feel a little bit more dark. But then as we move into Aquarius season, like, the sun starts setting a little bit later each day. And so our days are slowly growing longer every day. And so I always see this as our reminder to really like hold on to hope. Like, we've made it through the darkest part of winter and now we just have to make it through the coldest part of winter. And so Aquarius season is that time to really like, get in touch with those things that bring you hope. And then it's also a time to, kind of reflect on where you want to go, once it's warm out again and like we're not stuck inside. Because it's like, once we've made it through, like what are your dreams and your hopes and your visions for the future? And so now let's break it down into like the element and the modality of Aquarius. And so, like I've said probably a dozen times in this video so far, Aquarius is the fixed air sign of the zodiac. And so being a fixed sign, it's all about like stability and endurance and just like this desire to really hold their element sturdy and create something that will last using that element. And so in this case, it's air. And so air is associated with the mind and our perceptions. And so it's a very like mental sign and it's also a social sign. And so Aquarius is our third and final air sign, the first two being Gemini and Libra. And Gemini is the mutable air sign of the zodiac. So it's all about like, communication and taking in information, and it's ruled by Mercury. So it's like a very mentally active, like buzzy sign. And so I always tend to think of like a bee or a hummingbird going like flower to flower, collecting information. And then Libra is cardinal air, so it's all about like that initiation of these social connections. And so it has to do with like one-on-one relationships and making these connections with others. And being ruled by Venus, like it's very much about like, beauty and aesthetics. And so I always envisioned Libra as being like a bridge, really connecting people with each other. But now in Aquarius, this is like conceptual air. And so it has to do with ideas and systems and theories and, other kinds of frameworks and like these visions that we have for the future. So it's a sign that thinks abstractly, and it thinks in patterns and networks and structures and, being able to see like that higher perspective. Again, it sees like the whole grid and not just like those individual nodes. So it sees the whole forest, like not just the individual tree. And so that's why it can almost like appear to be detached, but, it's not avoiding emotion, but it's just really like prioritizing perspective and prioritizing like, the bigger picture. So again, it's all about like this abstract, like structural thinking. And I tend to always think of like mind mapping when I think of Aquarius, because it's like the architecture of ideas and just trying to get like the big picture of thoughts and ideas out there in order to like build something out of it. And so I think I've said it a few times, but I always think of like this castle in the sky kind of energy, because they're kind of like building this utopia and this future in their mind. And like this castle or, whatever it is that they're building in their mind, it's also constantly being like updated with, any new information that they're taking in. And so they're constantly like, updating their dreams and their vision for the future. So there is like this sense of like constantly updating like their visions and their ideals. And so sometimes they can lean into like this idealistic kind of energy where, again, they're just kind of building this utopia in their mind that is just totally unattainable, but they're also really trying to create something tangible, being ruled by Saturn and, out of their ideas, with a focus on like the bigger picture and just having to do with like, creating a better future for all. Because it's really focused on conceptualizing like how things are and how they really should be or how they could be. So that's part of the reason why there's such a strong like visionary quality to Aquarius. But they do tend to be like, very, very up in their head, because Aquarius is a very cerebral sign, but, they do have the ability to, think outside of the box and to really be open-minded and really, think differently than most people. And so they're very analytical in that way, and how they get from like point A to point B to point Z. They're very like focused on like, how do we get to point Z? And so it's really easy for an Aquarius to be like, all up in their head and kind of have like head in the clouds, because it's a very heady sign. And so what I always recommend to my Aquarian clients is to get like a good grounding practice and have like, lots of different grounding techniques on hand, because, they can, get stuck in their head and they can kind of detach from their body sometimes. But we want to be, living our lives in the present and, being more present in our bodies. And like, it's really cool to be able to have like these hopes and these dreams and these visions for the future in order to like, live in a world that better serves all of humanity. Like, someone's got to do it, but, you also gotta like keep coming back to the present, because life is happening in the present moment. And so being an air sign, it's also a social sign, but I would say of all of the air signs, Aquarius tends to be like the least social. Like they have a love of like community and a love of humanity, but they don't necessarily enjoy like being around people all the time. But again, they just have these ideas and these high ideals about, how the world should be. And so they want to include people in that. And so the Aquarians that tend to have like a whole network of people that they know who have like all kinds of different skills and all kinds of different resources. So they might kind of pull from these networks in order to, get different ideas and talk to all different kinds of people and, converse with people who are like, on the outskirts of society, who are not as widely accepted. They just have this ability to accept all kinds of people. And then as fixed air, that means that Aquarius stabilizes these ideas. And once Aquarius really commits to a belief or a vision, it really, holds on to it, sometimes stubbornly. And so fixed air really gives Aquarius like that ideological endurance in order to sustain movements and philosophies and innovations over time. But it also runs the risk of rigidity or dogma or contrarianism just for its own sake. But with Aquarius, it is this idea of just having something to, build off of. And so they need that fixity in order for them to like stand solidly and to stand firm. And so they put a lot of pressure on their ideas. And so that can make them, again, more stubborn. But it is what makes them such strong visionaries, because they can really hold on to that idea in their mind very, very strongly. And so again, you can really think of this Aquarius energy as being like that zoomed out perspective, or like that vantage point on top of that mountain. Or, one way that I like to think of it, and I've never heard another astrologer kind of talk about it in this way, but, I always think of like the ozone layer when I think of Aquarius. Because it's fixed air, it's not going anywhere, and it has a very like detached and zoomed out perspective that really, encapsulates all of humanity. And, it's fixed air, like, it's not going anywhere unless it's like global warming, which, that impacts all of humanity as well. And again, I always think of like this mad scientist in his lab, or like, the mage in the tower, where they're just like, thinking about all kinds of things and thinking about all of these solutions and trying to come up with like new inventions and innovate and trying to like improve our human experience. And it's not entirely like this lone wolf energy, but there is a very like individualistic energy to Aquarius. And so I found that the Aquarians in my life, they do tend to like to be alone. So they need a lot of space, and that kind of makes me think of that ozone layer as well. And so, it's not like they're going to be super warm and fuzzy and inviting if you invade their space. And so again, it is this energy of having like, a love of humanity, but not necessarily enjoying, being around people all the time, because it's an energy that knows how humanity can be, like, the good and the bad and the ugly. And so there is a desire here for them to just like, be a little bit more detached and just kind of like, keep everyone and everything at like an arm's distance, or, like a football field's distance some days. And it's not like they're taking this detached approach, or like they have this higher vantage point because they think that they're better than others. Although on the lower end, I have seen it be expressed that way, where they do think like, they're better than other people, or they're more woke, or they're more progressive, or more radical, or, whatever it is. But a better expression of Aquarius energy is just how they see everyone as being equals. And so Aquarius energy is very much like, everyone is on like equal playing field, where everyone is working together for a greater cause and for something that is just like, larger than the individual. And so again, it's like, that star within a constellation, like, being an individual within a group, and being involved in causes that really, matter to them, and that helps push humanity forward and helps evolve people. And so being fixed air, like you could also imagine like, a really brisk wind, or like a really big wind. It's kind of like the winds of change sometimes that really, it could impact like the whole community, and it really just like, brings everyone in that community together. And now moving on to Aquarius's double rulership. And so traditionally, Aquarius is ruled by Saturn, that planet of like boundaries and structure and discipline. And, we've talked about Saturn's rulership a lot already, but it is also co-ruled by the planet Uranus, that planet that is disruptive and rebellious, and it breaks out of the status quo. And so Aquarius really embodies like this blend of both Saturn and Uranus, of being like, structured and all about this long-term planning, yet with this unconventional and progressive innovation. And so I feel like Saturn's rulership over Aquarius really shows up in these, social systems and these institutions and these collective rules that people either choose to live by or they choose to break. And so this is the part of Aquarius that really understands that structure is necessary, but it should also be intelligently designed and also have the ability to be improved as we kind of move on. And then Uranus's rulership in Aquarius really brings like that disruptive and that innovative and that rebellious side to Aquarius that can bring like these sudden insights and these new awarenesses, and again like innovation and these hopes and dreams for the future. And it really helps us to break those things that no longer worked, sometimes abruptly. And when I think of Aquarius energy, I always think of like this electrical current type of energy that brings like sudden insights and sudden information and, this desire to suddenly take action. Uranus is that planet of like, the lightning bolt, and like it brings these sudden insights. And so that's kind of like, when I think of Aquarius, that's why I always think of like that electrical current. Like Aquarius takes these traditions and these rules that Saturn and Capricorn lives by, and it says like, okay, yes, this is how things have always been done, but that doesn't mean that we have to continue living this way, and we can actually improve these systems and make it better, and like, this is how I want to do it. Like Uranus says, like, what if we experiment here a little bit, and what if we innovate and try to improve this and make this system better for everyone? And so together, it really does kind of create a little bit of a paradox where Aquarius wants to rebuild the system while also like tearing it down. And so they can really be like these radical reformers who work within these structures in order to change them and innovate them and make them better. And so while Uranus kind of triggers that need for a revolution, Saturn then provides like that necessary discipline and structure in order to implement it. And so then as the fixed air sign, then Aquarius uses Saturn's focus in order to anchor in Uranus's unconventional ideas into society at large. And like I've been saying, Aquarius is symbolized by the water-bearer, but it is not a water sign. And so the water in the water-bearer's jug really represents like the flow of knowledge and the flow of consciousness and the flow of awareness and of ideas and innovation and truth really poured out for the collective. And so Aquarius doesn't like, hoard ideas, and it doesn't hoard insights, but it really helps to distribute it. It's also like the distribution of hope and inspiration as well. And so I've always really loved this symbolism for Aquarius because, it's this human being that's kind of like, detached from everyone else. And so they're being an individual, but it's just like, this is a human that maybe just needs like a little bit extra space from humanity. But again, it's a human that has like this higher vantage point, and it has like a zoomed out perspective, who sees the bigger picture of it all and just like, sees the potentiality of the future and for the collective. And so this water bearer is really, spreading this awareness and spreading these ideas universally to humanity. And so I think it's funny when Aquarians get stereotyped as like, the aliens, and, there is kind of like another worldly quality to them that's kind of like elusive, but, they're actually the most human of the signs. They are the humanitarian. And so being the water bearer, it's a human that is, distributing water to us. And, think about how important water is for humans to survive. And, think about like the watering hole. It's what, brings humans together. And so these water bearers, they're like, inadvertently bringing people together in order to share stories and share ideas and innovate. And actually like, innovation is a very human quality as well, where we're like gathering multiple different perspectives from all different walks of life and being like, okay, how can we make this work for everybody? And I also think about how like the water bearer really carries like information from these higher realms, the ideas that challenge the status quo, and they, release them into society, and, often whether people are ready for it or not. And so what the water bearer is trying to do is intellectually liberate people. And so again, it's not a water sign, but it does have to do with water in some way. But in this context, the water represents like the flow of ideas and information again. And, another way you could think about it is like, that jar or that container that the water bearer is holding is, kind of represents how Aquarius is able to compartmentalize their emotions. And like when you think about it, like, think about those times when you're in like a really highly emotional state, and how your emotions can sometimes like, cloud your judgment or cloud your ideas, or, cloud your perceptions or your perspective. And so Aquarius really has a gift and an ability to be able to kind of like detach and compartmentalize those emotions and really, save it for a different day, or at least a time where it's more appropriate. And so again, that doesn't mean that like Aquarians are not sensitive and they're not emotional and they're not unfeeling. And actually I found that the Aquarians that I know are very sensitive and they feel things very deeply. And being like that, like electric current of energy, it's almost like they can get overstimulated when they're like, feeling their feelings. And so they need to be in like a secure and safe environment in order to, be safe enough to feel their feels. And so they just need to be able to like, take some time and kind of distance themselves. And, again, they need that space in order to be able to mentally and emotionally and physically process their emotions. And so it might just take them a little bit more time to, figure out how they're feeling. And so like emotions and like, feeling your feelings just doesn't really come natural to Aquarius energy. And like, that's fine. We're not all meant to be like, this mushy gushy Cancer energy. This water bearer symbolism also kind of speaks to like the Aquarius energy when they're not necessarily expressing it in the highest way or the best way or whatever, because that water bearer is really meant to share their knowledge and share their ideas and that consciousness and that awareness. And so sometimes the Aquarians that tend to isolate themselves and cut themselves off from the rest of humanity, and they kind of get like this like I'm a lone wolf kind of mentality, that's when they can really like hoard their ideas and keep their ideas to themselves and really like hoard that inspiration or, whatever, just trying to like, cut themselves off. And so as they're like, keeping this jar to themselves and keeping all this knowledge or, whatever, that's kind of when they, cut themselves off, and they can kind of be like, solitary in that way where they are just kind of like, I've got me, myself, and I, and that's good enough. So sometimes when they're like, cut off from society, that's kind of when they can kind of veer into like this almost conspiratorial zone. And so again, you want to be sharing your ideas with others and sharing that innovation and that inspiration and like these future orientation, these future ideas. And now looking at the glyph for Aquarius, we've got like these two squiggly lines. And the way I always look at these is it's kind of like that flow of communication and that flow of ideas, or like, brain waves. And so these squiggly lines really represent like these currents of higher consciousness, really, flowing from one person to the next. It could also represent like that water being poured from the water bearer's jug, and that water that's pouring from the jug is to help cleanse us in order to start anew. Stephen Forrest says that these two squiggles actually represent two serpents or two snakes that go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, and it's like that serpent that urged Eve to eat the apple from the tree of knowledge. And so it's kind of like Eve in that single rebellious act from like, acquiring this knowledge from, this forbidden tree. She really birthed like, human liberation and human freedom. And so I always tend to think of like that Stephen Forrest analogy when I see those two squiggles. Now let's talk about some of the challenges that Aquarius placements might face, because I feel like I've spent enough time talking about like Aquarius at its best and like the Aquarius strengths and like, Aquarius when it wants to, improve humanity. And so let's talk about the challenges they might face when they're feeling like, under-resourced, because, no sign is perfect. And so that shadowy side of Aquarius can really show up as being like, super stubborn and uncompromising and just like unyielding. Like, of all the fixed signs, I feel like Aquarius is probably like the most stubborn, because it has to do with the mind, and everything starts as a thought. And so like, when they get stuck and stubborn and fixed on an idea, they can be very, very unyielding. And so they have this rigidity in their ideas where they can be very like, unwilling to change their mind. And that's kind of the irony, because they can be so against like these traditional ways of thinking, but then once they fix their mind on like their own ideal and like their own vision, they can really like, get stuck on it and really stick to it. Like you might hear them say like, I'm so intolerant of intolerant people. And so that's kind of like, hypocritical in a way. And so that's another like shadowy expression, is they can be hypocritical sometimes. And so they can be incredibly intolerant of people who, don't agree with their style of being and their style of thinking and their way of viewing the world. And again, they can be just very like emotionally detached and disconnected, and then in turn be like, hyper rational. And so that's that air quality where they really kind of prioritize logic over feelings. And so this can make them come across as being a little more like, cold or aloof, or just a bit more like impersonal, where they're engaging with people conceptually rather than like, emotionally. And so, for example, like an Aquarius moon, rather than trying to like, fully empathize and feel what you're feeling, like they might kind of be like, it'll all be okay in the long run. And like, they might kind of give you like these facts and these data and try to like, rationalize what you're going through. And so instead of being like, that person who gives like a super comforting hug, they can kind of be like, oh, they're there, and trying to analyze it and rationalize it in order to try and comfort you that way. It really just depends on like your level of closeness with this Aquarius moon person, because again, they're very sensitive and they can be empathetic, but they'd rather not try to, get into the mess of like, these emotions. Another shadowy quality that can come up is being like, dogmatic and even like, self-righteous. And so sometimes they can almost believe that like, their idea and their perspective is like, the most woke or like the most enlightened or like the most progressive. And so they can kind of get like a little morally superior sometimes. They can also kind of lean into like these contrarian qualities where, they have that really critical mind and the ability to, see things as how they should be. And so that can make them very quick and almost like reflexively oppose the mainstream, or, oppose that authority, or, whatever, just trying to, be different and go against the grain. And so again, they can get quite like conspiratorial, where they can be like, a conspiracy theorist, because they kind of get suspicious of power and suspicious of like, the dominant framework, or like the most like, again, the mainstream. And so being the contrarian that they are, it's kind of like they have an immediate rejection of the mainstream. And so that, combined with having like a really strong mind and a desire to see that future vision, these people can get really stuck on these conspiracy styles of thinking. With that future visioning as well, sometimes they can almost lean into like this detached utopianism. Like it's a sign that can become so obsessed with like that idealistic vision of the future and, how the future should be, but then it can really lack like that practical grounding sometimes. Like, great, yeah, exactly, that's how things should be, but, how are we actually going to get there realistically, given, the complexity of, our human experience and the complexity of the world that we live in. And so again, they can kind of, dream up this future, and they can kind of be like that castle in the sky, where it's like that castle ends up staying in the sky. It's kind of like they think that in theory, this is how we should get there. And, just because they can envision it and think it in their minds means that it can actually happen. When in reality, that's not exactly the reality. And so they're really good at envisioning like this utopian future, but it can be really detached from reality sometimes. Another shadowy quality that might come up is that it's kind of like, they can really isolate themselves. And so there is a very like, isolating quality that like, I don't need anyone but myself kind of syndrome. And so they can get fixed on this mentality that they're like, a lone wolf or whatever. And so they can really like sometimes fully withdraw from others and community at times, really creating like this self-imposed distance and really, alienating themselves and ostracizing themselves in that process. It's almost like the material world is just like, not ideal for them. And so there can be this sense of like, self-alienating quality that Aquarius can fall into. But they do have that like innate love of humanity, but they may not always enjoy being around people because they just, feel like an outsider, or they feel different. And so it's kind of like an under-resourced Aquarius. They tend to, isolate themselves. And so they're not able to express some of like those higher expressions of Aquarius when they cut themselves off from others and they cut themselves off from, communities. And so that kind of leads to those shadowy qualities of being like, conspiracy theories and, antisocial behavior and, just feeling different from everybody. And so they have like, that withdrawing quality sometimes. And so Aquarius can sometimes confuse like, emotional distance and that need for, space from like other people and that need for a little bit of distance. They can sometimes confuse that as like freedom or like liberation, but the growth edge is learning that, connection doesn't automatically mean like, you're being like tied down or smothered or, inhibited or limited in any way. And so community is so, so important for Aquarius, and, having networks and having acquaintances and friendships and, being able to be emotionally vulnerable with at least one or two people. And so if you want to, move humanity forward and, bring freedom and liberation for all of humanity, you do that by, working together as a group and as a collective. And so part of Aquarius's like, evolutionary journey is moving from detachment into conscious participation with the collective and with humanity, and moving from, just rebellion, like rebel without a cause, into reformation and building something that, suits all of humanity. And moving away from like that isolation and like that individualistic thinking into, the power of community. It's kind of like if we want to build towards a future that we actually want to live in, like, it's teamwork makes the dream work, and it takes a village. And so the lesson is that like, learning that being a human doesn't diminish our vision, but it grounds our visions in this material reality. And so Aquarius teaches us that progress requires courage and imagination and holding a vision super strong in your mind and having a willingness to, question what everyone else accepts as, being normal. And so this is a sign that really embodies the future, and it carries this energy of like freedom and liberation and evolution of humanity as a whole. And it really has this ability to, see this future vision super early. And yeah, that is my Aquarius 101 video, and I know I talked a lot and I had a lot to say and I didn't even get to everything that I wanted to say, but I've been yapping long enough. So if you've stuck with me this long, thank you so much for watching. And if you have Aquarius placements, maybe comment down below and let me know if any of this resonated. And next in my Zodiac 101 series, we have the final sign being Pisces. So be sure to like and subscribe so you can follow along on my other, Astrology 101 series. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, love you, bye!